Well, good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to the CTSI Symposium, which is obviously being broadcast live. And we welcome wherever you may be. You may be at work at the moment, or at your kitchen table, or even watching this recorded, because we're recording this particular session for you to watch later on. Well, what a peculiar year this has been, and there have been many surprises, both good and bad. But we at CTSI, we believe we couldn't have a year without a symposium. Unfortunately, it's not the symposium we would have liked, that face-to-face where we can do lots and lots of networking. However, we've got this technology now, this new technology that we've used to be able to broadcast to you for the whole of this week. I please ask that you are a little bit patient with us. This is new technology that we're using, and there may be small delays between the changing of the speakers, etc. But I think you'll understand that we wanted to be able to go ahead with this symposium for this week. Without further ado, I would like to welcome the Minister. He's been very kind, Minister Scully, very kind to send us a recorded video about his thoughts about this year, and also where trading standards fits in the government's thoughts about now going through this particular time, and also in the future, how we can support businesses and consumers. So I'll ask now for the video to be run of the Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak at the symposium. It's always good to meet those who are working on the front line. I'm sorry that the small matter of COVID-19 prevents us from being together in person. Normally, speeches of this nature would start with a comment about the venue, with perhaps some sort of historic reference. This year, though, instead of Southport as planned with its famous air and flower shows, we were meeting over the not quite so glamorous video conference with the ubiquitous catchphrases, "Can you hear me?" and "You're still muted." Well, hopefully you can all hear me today. The theme of this year's symposium is 2020 Vision. Looking on from last year, who would have thought that back in December we'd be facing one of the biggest crises to confront us all since the Second World War? This time, though, instead of fighting on the beaches, we're fighting in the laboratories to find a cure. These are truly historic and challenging times, and yet through it all, training standards and individual practitioners, such as all of you, have carried on working to protect consumers and inform businesses of their rights and obligations. It's all vital work to help restart the economy following lockdown. Some of you, by carrying out your duties, have put yourself at risk by being on the front line. I personally thank you for all your sterling work, dedication and enthusiasm, not only during these unique times, but in those other times when the public eye may well have been elsewhere. On Friday, I look forward to introducing the Hero Awards. These recognise some of the important work that's done by individuals and teams, the unsung heroes of the service. But it's only fair that I tell you a little bit about myself. I've been an MP since 2015. Before being an MP, I ran a number of small businesses myself and served as a councillor in the London Borough of Sutton. In 2017, I was appointed as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Brunei, Thailand and Myanmar, and was the Parliamentary Private Secretary to Baroness Evans, the leader of the House of Lords, between November and January that year. In February this year, I was appointed Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BAINS for short. I'm responsible for small business, labour markets and of course consumers. I'm also Minister for London. As I said, these are challenging times though. Not only do we have COVID-19 to contend with, but also negotiations are taking place on free trade deals with the EU and the rest of the world. The question that often gets raised is how will the high consumer protection standards that we already have in place be maintained after the 31st of December? How will regulation look? Well, I have to begin by saying that we're proud of our consumer protection regime. It's among the most robust in the world, and the UK has a strong history of protecting consumers. UK consumers will continue to enjoy those high standards after the transition period ends. When buying from UK-based traders, UK consumers' rights will remain the same after transition. Most businesses will not need to take any action except to continue to comply as normal with UK consumer law. It's important that we work with others to protect consumers. For example, fake lotteries, misleading prize draws, unproven health supplements, and clairvoyance scams sent by email can cost victims millions of pounds a year. Working together with partners and overseas enforcement agencies, the National Trading Standards Scams Team helps to disrupt and ensure enforcement action is taken against the people behind these scams. Looking ahead, we're negotiating ambitious free trade agreements with our international partners, including the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. This includes robust provisions on consumer protection and cross-border enforcement, which will reinforce existing levels of protection and establish greater trust in cross-border markets. We will continue the CTSI European Consumer Centre through 2021, while we assess what role it can play in this new environment. For example, the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement was agreed in principle by International Trade Secretary Liz Truss and the Japanese Foreign Minister on the 11th of September. This deal secures additional benefits beyond the EU-Japan trade deal, including strengthened cooperation on consumer protection. As outlined in our manifesto, the government is committed to give the Competition and Markets Authority enhanced powers to tackle consumer rip-offs and bad business practices. BEIS and CMA have been working closely together to develop the proposals made originally by Lord Tyree of the CMA in 2019. We refer proposals in the 2018 Consumer Green Paper designed to strengthen powers of national criminal enforcers. We're seeking to enhance the resilience of the enforcement system to address present and future challenges, particularly focusing on the vulnerable and the issues that matter most to consumers' everyday lives. We're assessing exactly how these changes will help trading standards enforce national cases. Unsurprisingly, COVID-19 has had a damaging effect on our economy. It'll take time to recover from its impact. BEIS is at the centre of our plans for economic recovery. BEIS's new mission is leading Britain's recovery. This is designed to underpin the department's objective as it moves forward to tackle the challenges that lie ahead. We've developed our current priorities around backing businesses, unleashing innovation, and tackling climate change to fit this vision as BEIS leads the COVID-19 recovery for the UK. And we need to work with our partner organisations to make this happen. Trading Standards has a pivotal role in protecting our markets from fake and counterfeit goods and informing businesses where they need to comply with the law. This will help build consumer confidence, which is key in helping to kickstart our economy as consumers start to spend following lockdown. Consumers want goods that are safe and sold by businesses that they can trust. This will be important when it comes to revitalising our economy. Now, this is a space where Trading Standards can really make its presence felt and contribute to our nation's economic recovery. Government is carried on in partnership with others. CTSI and the trading standards profession is one of those important partnerships that links government to those on the ground and ultimately the people that we all serve in one way or another. I look forward to building on that relationship and working with you in the future. This week's programme looks interesting and should develop some stimulating discussion. I'm sorry that I won't be able to attend the individual sessions, but I'm really interested in hearing the outcomes of the discussions and how the 2020 vision is taken forward in practice. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you once more for your continuing professionalism and dedication in these unusual and strange times.
Thank you very much, Minister Scully, for that very, very encouraging speech. We do welcome the thoughts that you have in mind for trading standards being at the heart of what the government see as being that connection between government and businesses. And also very welcome news that the CTSI Consumer Contact Centre will be will be kept open for 2021. That has certainly been very advantageous to our consumers in the UK during this pandemic. I would also like to say well done to Trading Standards and add to the Minister's thoughts there how during this last few months Trading Standards have stepped up and responded once again to the crisis that we've had, particularly in being able to enforce the business closure and also now the business restrictions legislation. It was a pleasure working with many of you who are listening today on the business closures and PPE and hand cleansing changes. Business closures legislation was a very quickly written legislation. I didn't have much time for consultation and certainly no regulatory impact assessment. And there was many issues, as we know, with the interpretation. But together we navigated our way through that to help in the end what was the intention of that legislation to stop the spread of COVID-19. And that's a fine example really of why getting regulation right does matter, which is obviously the theme of this plenary session this morning. Getting regulation right, why does it matter? And the Minister clearly identified all the issues that are now on us with the pandemic, but also the thoughts turn to the EU exit and all the trade deals that are being done now and how that will affect consumer and business, consumer protection and business recovery in the next few months. So what we want out of this morning is to understand, continue to understand the value of trading standards within the consumer protection landscape in the light of the current issues we have and in the future context. And we have speakers today who are the leading lights in our profession. We have first up Graham Russell, Chief Executive of the Office of Product Safety, followed by Damien Doherty, the Chief Inspector from Northern Ireland Trading Standards. He works for the Government of Northern Ireland. Emily Miles has joined us, who is the Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency, and then Mick King, who's the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. We welcome and thank them this morning for joining us. Well, without further ado, I will invite Graham Russell from the OPSS to join us. I've had a pleasure working with Graham, working with him and for him for many years. In fact, Graham was the first person that introduced me to TSI by taking me to the first branch in West Brom back in '96, I believe it is. So thank you very much, Graham, for doing that. So I'll hand over to you now to continue on the session. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks very much, Phil, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody who's managed to make it onto this call. What I can see on my screen is 6 images, most of which are people scurrying around like crazy trying to make it all work for you. When we started this session, I think Phil lacked a chair and lacked, I think, 2 of his 4 speakers. I've got no idea how much progress is being made towards filling those gaps, but I'm pleased to say that I'm on the call, and I'm sure Phil has a good plan for what happens when I finish speaking. But it was great to hear from the Minister, wasn't it? And I wanted to start by saying thank you to, obviously Noel isn't with us, but thank you to him for his leadership of the profession, to Phil for chairing our session this morning, and to Leon and everyone at CTSI for all the work they've done through the last year, and also the imagination and vision to put on this conference symposium in this way. It would be easy to cancel, but actually I think connecting people is really important, and I know it's not easy. I know that the well-honed machine that brings an annual event to you as members is really valued, and this is rather different, but I think people have worked really hard and really well to make this possible, so thank you to all those who've done that. And I wanted to join with the Minister in thanking you for the work that you as trading standards professionals have done, particularly in these last months when things have been so unusual and so different, and it has really shown the adaptability and the importance of local delivery and local services. Last year at our conference, we watched a powerful video of the crises that regulators have had to deal with over the last 20 years. I'm sure it struck you as it struck me as we watched images from Grenfell Tower, foot and mouth, going right through horsemeat and many other issues that have been crises affecting this country and the profession. And I was very struck by that at the time, and it left me wondering what sort of regulators we need to be for those kind of issues. Of course, what we didn't know then was everything that would unfold in the 12 months since, and particularly in the last 6 months. Last year, we didn't know what this crisis would be like, but what it has demonstrated is the need for local regulators as capable, flexible workforce. And I think just to illustrate that with some of the things that you've been doing in the last 6 months that we're aware of at the Office for Product Safety and Standards. Phil's already mentioned the work that Trade and Standards and Environmental Health have done locally, first of all to enforce business closures, then support safe reopening of businesses, and now to deal with local lockdowns, different restrictions in different parts of the country, prospects of further changes, but also supporting environmental health colleagues on track and trace and workplace social distancing. Alongside that, very important from our perspective on products has been the work on personal protective equipment. And we've seen local authorities dealing with unsafe equipment. And I think in Edinburgh, for example, 241,000 masks were taken out of circulation, 900,000 gloves. Colleagues working at the ports and borders, particularly the Coventry Postal Hub, Heathrow, Manchester, Doncaster airports, and then the ports, Felixstowe, Southampton and others. A really effective shared operation connected with inland services working to ensure that unsafe products didn't come onto the market at a time when that product supply chain was completely disrupted. And at the same time working to support local businesses to produce safe products, supporting local authority purchasing and local resilience forums. And again, an example from Essex where 3.7 million masks were made available to the local authority through the support of the trade and standards teams there. And not just PPE, but ensuring supply of products more generally, particularly biocides in hand sanitisers and disinfectants, where lots of new producers came into the market. We needed to ensure that the good was separated out from the unsafe, that those who wanted to make safe products were supported to do so, and those who frankly wanted to rip people off at a time of crisis were eliminated from the market, and local authority trade and standards right at the forefront of that. And of course, it's not just on product safety, but as the Minister mentioned, all sorts of other areas of consumer protection, including price gouging, contract terms, and then more generally across the contribution of local authority services. And I know some people in the front line have been deployed in all sorts of other areas, whether that's supporting people in homeless hostels, food parcel distribution, all sorts of other ways in which local authorities have been at the front line. So for all those things and many more that I'm not aware of, but you've been working hard on, I think you deserve and should get the thanks of government and more generally of society. And it's good when we hear of local authority regulators being recognised, but I'm conscious that doesn't always happen. But when we turn from what's happened to where the future goes, none of us know exactly what the future response will be. But I think it is a good time as we gather together in this symposium to say, what can we learn so far? And the reflections that we've had in the team here have really been in 4 areas, which I wanted to share with you, which I think will help to guide all of us in thinking about the future of services. First of all, COVID-19 has, to me, changed the way that society works, both as an event and the massive impact it's had on UK society and frankly global society. Who could have imagined that we would shut down almost all premises, people would work from home in the way they have, schools would be shut for the period they were shut for. The impact of the nature of the disease, the nature of the spread of the disease, the impact on people's lives, families, friends, from bereavement, but also from the social impact of lockdown have been quite amazing and quite unpredictable. And yet at the same time, we've also seen how one single virus can completely change the way we operate at a global level. The whole way that we operate at trade, national, international levels has been impacted. And that will never go away. Whatever happens next, 2020 will always be asterisked in any statistical record for the size and consequence of that impact. All sorts of records have been changed and statistical impact has been enormous. And the first thing that we can say is that regulators need to be adaptable and understand and address we don't like the phrase the new normal because we don't know what this new normal is, but whatever that new normal may turn out to be, regulators will need to be adaptable to address that. And we can't assume that the future is in any way the same as the past. I think we can go further than that and say that COVID is just one of a series of global, national and global and international and national events. And it feels like they're coming with increasing force and frequency. If we go back to that video from last year and those events that have impacted, it feels like they're coming more frequently over the years and months. Maybe they are. It's hard to get an evidence base for that. Maybe it feels like that because of globalization and the increasingly shrinking communication channels that we hear about things more quickly. But we think about financial and economic events, weather, storm, fire events around the world, health and animal health and environmental impacts, war, terrorism impacts, all sorts of global events that are changing the way we operate. And it strikes me that when we think about those things, there's very few that don't have some kind of trading standards response. Trading standards at the front line locally, but also working together nationally, seem to be called into all of these crises, whatever their flavour is. And so I think that regulators, secondly, need to be agile to prepare for the next shock without knowing what that will be. Communities expect them to fulfil different roles in different crises, whether that's going back to my days in local authorities, going out to petrol stations and trying to organise rationing of petrol in a oil tanker delivery drivers strike, right through to what we've seen in the last 6 months. Communities expect trading standards to be at the forefront of that. And also businesses and communities expect regulators to provide assurance in those turbulent times. And Phil's already mentioned the challenge of providing simple, clear advice when the law is changing on an almost daily basis, and when it's different in different parts of the country, not just across the 4 nations, but even within those nations in local lockdown. And I know from the correspondence that I've seen that some of you have looked to OPSS for more authoritative advice. And sometimes when I reflect on what we've done, we've managed to get that right. And sometimes we could have done it better. I recognise that it's been a very, very turbulent and changing time. But that ability to provide clear advice to people, be they businesses or communities, when things are changing so fast, is right at the heart of what we need. And I'm not going to pretend that you will always get very clear, precise advice from a national level. When things are changing that quickly, a lot of this is about flexibility and adaptability to local circumstances and local change. And so I think the ability to provide that assurance, working both locally and nationally, is key to the future. And it's one of the skills of regulators to look at an uncertain situation and give people a clear way through. And I think that will be one of the things that we need to work well together in the future, and certainly something we're focused very strongly on. The third of my 4 is that for the UK, EU exit means that with the UK having to provide its own regulatory capability and capacity from the end of the transition period on the 1st of January, there's new expectations on UK regulators. A lot of that is on national regulators to provide that national coverage that in many ways we receive from the European Union, but it's not just at the national level, it's also locally. And we need regulators that are competent to provide regulation and confidence in this new market. And particularly as we trade internationally and we look for the global Britain to be able to trade and support businesses around the world, we need regulators that are nimble and agile and ready to respond. I had the privilege last week of co-chairing a session with our Secretary of State with some of the largest businesses in the UK and asking them what sort of regulatory environment we need as we leave the European Union. And they didn't say we need regulators to step back and let us soldier on into a new innovative future. What they actually said is we need regulators nationally and locally who can work with us, recognise the challenges of businesses in the new future, but also support us so that the UK can be a leader of innovation, research and development, and effective working and effective production of goods, both for UK markets, but also for international markets. There isn't a call for regulators to disappear, but there is a call for regulators to be agile and innovative alongside the businesses that we seek to work with. And that is actually the best way to protect consumers as well, if we are working with those businesses to bring safe products to market. And then my fourth area is really thinking about those products and the pace of innovation that we see. And it's easy when we have the level of circumstance going on at the moment with COVID and so on, to forget the fact that underlying all of that is massive changes in the products that we buy and the way that we buy them. And that applies particularly for OPSS in thinking about products, whether that's the digital products that we're buying, the technical products that we're buying. We're just about to launch a new program called Fridge 2050. What are the white goods that we'll have in our homes in the future, and how do we make sure they're safe as well as connected? How do we make sure their impact on the environment is minimum and connected with a zero carbon future? And how do we support businesses to design those products, but also consumers to be ready to use those products in those new ways? And we want to look beyond just the next year, and we're deliberately setting that out there. We're calling it Fridge 2050 to recognise that even the most basic goods in our homes will change. But also the way we buy those goods will change as well. We talk a lot about the challenges of regulating the online market, and so we should, because that's a massive issue for all of us at the moment. But will we still be buying goods online? Will goods still be delivered to us in white vans in 5 years' time? Or will 3D printers be the way that people get hold of their goods, and actually it'll be controlling and making sure that software delivers safe products, that recalls work effectively in that new world? And so we need regulators to not just regulate for the past or even just for the present, but to regulate for the future. And that isn't the way regulation necessarily works best. We look at fixed law, we look at law that's clear and unambiguous, and yet regulating for innovation will demand that we think differently. And we need to be innovators ourselves in the way that we regulate. This summer has seen public confidence in algorithms be really challenged over the A-level exam results, and yet use of big data enabling us to understand what's going on out there and then use that data to regulate well and to intervene at the right points, I think will be key to the future. So we have a major challenge in being those regulators. So those are my four descriptors, if you will, of what I think is going on at the moment and the kind of regulators that we need to be to respond to that. I'm conscious that's a major challenge at a time when we're all far too busy. So what do we do now? Well, I think there's three things that we can do together to help us move into that new future. The first is to focus on a systems-based approach. We can't, any of us, fix these problems on our own, either nationally or locally. First in the system is consumers, and the way that consumers interact with businesses, the way that consumers are informed to make good choices, to use information well, and to be intelligent articulators, demanders of good, safe product and good, safe supply methods. Secondly, the parts of the system are the way that businesses work with us as regulators, and to ensure that we understand their role in effective compliant behaviour and also our role as regulators in supporting them in that, but also dealing with those examples of non-compliance that put consumers at risk and frankly also undermine the other businesses in that market. And then the third part of the system, I think, is for us as national regulators working with you as local regulators to have an effective end-to-end delivery chain. And so if we can think about that system, consumers, businesses, regulators, local and national regulators, I think we can all play our part. Secondly, I think we need to continue our work to improve our understanding of risk. We know that we can never be everywhere doing everything. We haven't got enough resources for that, but frankly, it's not a good idea even if we could. We have to be at the right places doing the right things, and that must be based on good intelligence, well shared, well used, and driven into a risk system. And then thirdly, as I've said, we need to work with innovation. We need to be at the forefront of pushing forward some of these challenging conversations. I'm confident that we can do that. I'm confident that we can work together. I think we look at the last year as being a year of challenge, but also success in those local and national relationships and those relationships between you and your local communities. I think you're rightly praised for the work you do, and I want to be part of thanking you for that and look forward to the conversation. Thanks very much, Phil. Over to you.
Thank you, Graham, for your very encouraging speech this morning. Brought home really the fact that, yes, every year now we seem to be getting more and more issues that nobody can sort of see what the future will hold. But if we have an agile workforce, trading standards workforce, focus on building a resilient trading standard service, and by also looking at the competency of the officers, which is why we have this symposium as well. And also the last few points you mentioned about having a focused system-based approach, looking at making sure that we target the areas that need to be targeted through risk, and certainly the innovation that's taking place now. Something like this this virtual symposium would have never thought about delivering just only a few months ago. So innovation is certainly key to where we're going with the future. So that's thank you very much for that. Just a reminder to all those who are attending, you can ask questions of the speakers. I'm going to have a session at the end when the speakers have finished their presentations to take a few of your questions, please. You can do that by using the question box that you will see on your screens. If you put your questions in there, the CTSI team will have a look at those questions and I'll be able to bring them up later. Please ask that they are questions rather than statements, so that we can ask the speakers for their response to them. Okay, so our next leading light is Damien Doherty, who's the Chief Inspector for the Northern Ireland Government, the trading standards, and we'll hand over to him now to take this session forward, please. So Damien, listen to your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I'm like Graham, I just want to say many thanks for being invited here to speak. I suppose it's hard to avoid starting off with COVID and what we've experienced in the last 6 months. I think many of us were
Looks like we've lost Damien for a few moments. Okay, so we move on to Emily? No. Just give us a few moments, folks. That'll be good. Emily is ready. We could take Emily to carry on with the symposium. Can we hand over to Emily Miles, who's the Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency, please? Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Phil, and good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to see you. I feel like this morning has been an absolute example of the flexible and innovative approach to managing a symposium. There's been lots of activity in the background trying to help us log on and get it all right. And so big thanks to the team here. And obviously Damien will be on shortly, I think, when he sorts out his video. Look, it's a delight for me to be joining you this morning, albeit virtually, in this innovative format. And I've been the Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency for 12 months. This is my South London office. My youngest also does their homework from here. There's a dog here too, Lulu the Labradoodle. So apologies that you're getting an insight into my home life as well as my work life, but that is what this is like at the moment, isn't it? And we've all had to be flexible and work differently. And I wanted to start really with a big thank you to all of you trading standards officers for what you have done in the last few months. I think it's been a difficult time for everyone. In the Food Standards Agency, we have our meat hygiene inspectors who've also been out on the front line, key workers trying to make sure that food is safe, and you've been doing the same. You've proved again why trading standards officers are such essential workers. And hearing about your work to tackle scams, to put consumers and communities first over the last few months, you have been showing that care and that commitment to fairness that is so important that we provide as regulators. So just a huge thank you to you, from me to you and from the FSA to you. I just want to turn now to food. I know food is a subsection of your work, but food is all of my work and all of the FSA's work, and it matters. It touches the lives of every one of us several times a day. We share it with our loved ones, we give it to our children. It can make us well, it can make us ill. And it's also a massive part of our economy. The food industry employed 4.1 million people in Great Britain in 2019. Now, you'll know that the Food Standards Agency's mission is food you can trust. And that means that the public has got confidence in the food industry, which in turn helps the UK's economic recovery. So food you can trust earns us export markets abroad, it earns businesses consumer interest at home. And therefore the regulatory system underpinning food is crucial. It's crucial to our health, it's crucial to our well-being, but it's also crucial to the UK's economy. Over the last few months, you have had to be extremely flexible in the way you've done that regulatory role. And as you'll know, the Food Standards Agency took measures to support local authorities as part of our response, as part of government's response to COVID-19. We got a lot of feedback from you about how pressured you were and how things were changing so rapidly with the hospitality industry being closed in March. So we initially agreed to defer all planned food hygiene and food standards interventions, other than those where there were specific legislative requirements. And we advised local authorities to focus resources on urgent reactive work to address serious public health risks. And then as the initial lockdown restrictions were eased and the hospitality sector reopened, we updated our advice to indicate that physical inspections should resume where possible and informed by remote assessments. So again, innovation happening. We've asked that you prioritise your available resources towards businesses where there were known risks as a result of the impact of the pandemic, including new businesses, and reopening businesses where they've had a prolonged period of closure, or those changing the nature of their operations, such as starting a delivery service. You have shown a lot of flexibility, and the speed at which government and local government has responded to changing risks is an example of how we can adapt rules, how we can adapt regulations and practices to respond to risk in a crisis. We're very conscious at the FSA of the impact that COVID-19 has had on your workforce. And we did a survey in August, and in early September. The results we got back a week or two ago, and it suggests that at least half of local authorities have had to divert at least half of their EHO and TSO posts to COVID-related work, and many have diverted much more. So that, coupled with the existing ongoing gaps in funding, are putting unique pressures on you at the moment. For that reason, for the time being, we've extended our advice and the guidance to priority activities until the end of January, and we're going to keep this under close review given what's changing rapidly in the risk landscape. And I will be writing to chief executives of local authorities shortly to reinforce the importance of making resources available for food controls, taking it back to that point I made at the start, which is how important the regulatory system is to our livelihoods, to our health, but also to the economy of the UK. I want to just pause on this local authority funding question, because to regulate better, we do need to have an efficient regulatory system, but we also need enough resources in the regulatory system to make it work. And I think the pandemic has reminded us of the funding shortages in the trading standards profession. And all those who've been working on food safety in local authorities, things that you have been contending with over many years. And just to give you some facts, so 81% of the professional posts that local authorities said they needed to run their food service under normal circumstances were allocated in their budgets for 2020 and 2021. And not all of those funded posts were filled, and we understand that in April, local authorities were working with only around 3/4 of what they considered necessary at that point. And then since then, about 69% of local authorities have less than half of the required full-time equivalent posts available to deliver food controls. So it's diminishing. An NAO report last year found that food hygiene staff numbers declined by an estimated 13% per 1,000 food businesses. That was between 2012-13 and 2017-18. And the number of food standards staff fell in total by an estimated 45%. So that's much, much bigger than the food hygiene fall. Now, the Food Standards Agency has been watching this over some time, and the FSA board has said repeatedly that it both wishes to help make the regulatory system more efficient, so that resources are properly tailored to risk. But it also believes that the funding simply isn't enough, and there isn't enough available for local authorities to carry out their duties on food safety and particularly on food standards. And this poses a risk, a real risk to consumer protection. I just want to say that to you. I think you've been grappling with the sense of less resource, of colleagues leaving, of having complicated and moving picture in terms of food businesses happening in front of you in your local communities. And huge thanks again for all that you're doing, but I think it's clear that the system does not have enough resource in it at the moment. The future of the food regulatory system is going to be different to what we've known. The past is not going to predict the future. Since 2015, we have witnessed some of the most significant changes to the food system that this country has known for decades, even generations. From January, the UK will be in charge of its own food law for the first time in 50 years, and that has been a matter of some obsession for us at the Food Standards Agency for the last 3 or 4 years as we get ready for the end of the transition period. So that's going to be new. There's then the fourth industrial revolution that's been going on, which means increasing use of technology in food production, a changed relationship between the vendor and the consumer, and the growth of digital platforms and the move online of many businesses. I know Graham said earlier that would we be still receiving things in white vans in 5 years' time, or would we be 3D printing? The white vans are going to be around for a while, I would say, and the online approach and the delivery in that way is where things are, and we have to meet that trend as it moves. We also need to meet the trend around 3D printing, although there isn't so much 3D printing of food. I think they've done raspberries. These drivers, so EU exit and the end of the transition period, the fourth industrial revolution, they create challenges and they create opportunities. And as regulators, we have to enable this innovation and not stifle it. And the FSA wants to do this in a way that makes it easy for businesses to do the right thing by consumers. We're not here to make life hard, to make it opaque or complicated or difficult or confusing for businesses, because businesses are the ones that make food safe for consumers. So we need to be here to make it as easy as possible for them to get it right for consumers. And we can do that by being outcome-based and, in the future, less prescriptive but more clear about the overall approach. It's what Graham was describing earlier about thinking about the systems. I want to give you a little bit of information about our Achieving Business Compliance programme, which is a development of the Regulating Our Future programme that we had run for 3 or 4 years. And these new business models that businesses are operating on platforms with online, they bring potential risks of lowering the thresholds for entry of a food business. You don't need bricks and mortar anymore. Consumers don't always know exactly who they're buying from. Now, our regulatory system has been built on food around physical premises that increasingly don't reflect the reality of the food system. So we do need to amend how we regulate, and we've been thinking about this for a while, and it's developing. We need to meet these challenges, but also seize these opportunities. So what do we want to do? We think local authorities, EHOs and trading standards officers will continue to play a key role in ensuring that businesses do the right thing. I said we are pragmatic about resources. We know that it has to be as efficient as possible, but we have also been making the case to the Treasury via the Ministry for Housing and Communities and Local Government that there needs to be more funding for food controls in SR20. Whether that case will be heard, we don't know, but we've been making that case. The vast majority of the 500,000 food businesses in the UK, so around 97% of the 500,000, are small and medium enterprises. And so most regulation will still be conducted based on checks at individual premises that will be primarily done by local authorities. And we want to refine how this is done to enable you to ensure that your limited resources are targeted at the areas of the greatest risk. But, and we've known this for a while, some actors are more influential than others. Some food businesses are more influential than others. The top 10 supermarkets in the UK are responsible for 95% of all retail sales. So if you think about those 10 businesses and their impact across that food system that Graham was describing, it's major. Similarly, digital platforms have considerable reach. So in 2017, the Competition and Markets Authority estimated that of the 120,000 takeaway restaurants in the UK, 35,000 have historically provided delivery services, and of those, at that point, 70% were listed on just one online platform, Just Eat. Now, I know that Just Eat have got over 38,000 businesses, so they've obviously grown since 2017. So for some businesses, for those ones that have particularly big impact, the FSA wants to work with you to develop a more systems-led approach to regulation. The way we regulate must recognise that these businesses are networks that have huge impact over a significant proportion of the food industry. And we've been able to do that with Just Eat, for instance, where Just Eat scoops up our food hygiene ratings, the ones that local authorities award on a daily basis, into their digital platform, and that information is then displayed to the consumer so it can enable their choice as they choose a food. But it also means that Just Eat is saying you need to get a 3 or above to be on their platform as a new takeaway, and that's driving up performance in terms of food safety in the food industry. So through that partnership with Just Eat, we are able to influence the behaviour of many, many businesses. And that's what I mean by saying some businesses are more influential than others, and we need to develop a regulatory approach that recognises that. The Achieving Business Compliance programme is structured around key themes, therefore, so 3 key themes: evolution and refinement of the current local authority-based system. Secondly, ongoing mapping of the system across the state, market and consumer so that we can understand these trends. And thirdly, these approaches that build on the data and digital opportunities of these aggregated approaches. On the first theme, the refinement of the current system, we are doing things like pushing still for mandatory display of food hygiene ratings in England. We've been asking for that for some time. The Public Accounts Committee endorsed that request last Christmas, and we've been making our case to ministers and hope that we will get the powers to do that soon. We also are pushing ahead with our new food standards model, which many of you will know about. This is a more intelligence-led targeting of official controls for standards, and it ensures that interventions are targeted at the point in the food chain where they can have the greatest impact. It includes an element of directed sampling, where the FSA will fund local authorities to take samples where our national risk assessment suggests that it's needed. And I just want to say another thank you, which is a big thank you to those local authorities and officers who've been supporting us in developing the proposals, and we're about to go into a period of pilot for that. It was due to commence in April. COVID-19 delayed that, so we're going to be rolling the pilot out with, I think, 20 local authorities from January. Also, as part of this evolving the existing system, we will continue to develop our digital services that make your job easier. So registering a food business, you will know about. We currently have 173 local authorities using this system. We've had 26,000 registrations received through this route so far. And we want all businesses, wherever they are, to access this technology. And I am so grateful that we've done that work already, because over the last 6 months, it's meant that we as the central competent authority have had sight of the picture of new food businesses across the UK in reasonably real time. And we know that there have been we can see the risk changing in front of our eyes. So 45% of new businesses that were registered since the end of March are home-based. That's much more than it used to be. So the previous period, only 30% of new businesses were home-based. So we can see that the way that food businesses are operating is shifting. I want to just touch again on that last theme I mentioned around data and digital opportunities for regulation. To say that data and networks and sensors are fast becoming the tools which businesses use to maintain the integrity and the resilience of their systems. And so we, the regulators, need to set standards for how that data gets used and assure ourselves in those areas. So that's the territory we will be moving into. And we also want to do more to get platforms like Uber Eats and Deliveroo and Just Eat and Amazon to use our data, so that that is informing how people can get onto those platforms, businesses can get onto those platforms. The good practice and behaviour of those businesses is reinforced through those platforms. And that's where our traditional regulation can be amplified by those digital approaches. So at the heart of our challenge is how we translate the physical world into a digital one. So that's achieving business compliance and what we're doing there. There are loads of other things I could talk about, and maybe in the questions you might want to follow up with. So for example, last week we published the National Food Crime Unit and Food Standards Food Crime Strategy Assessment. There's lots of material in there which will be of great interest to you. There's all the questions about novel foods. We obviously made an announcement about CBD earlier this year. There's questions about sampling, our EU exit responsibilities, and so on. So I'm conscious I haven't covered all of that territory. I guess I just want to finish by saying again that these have been the most extraordinary times for our country. Even before we knew what COVID-19 was, Brexit was causing us to look differently at how we work together in the future to maintain high standards for food safety and authenticity. And as I said before, those high standards are essential to us as individuals, to our health, our well-being, but also to us as a country from an economic point of view. We have got to be prepared for the challenges and the opportunities ahead. And I'm very, very grateful to the work that we get to do with you every day, but also to opportunities like this, so that we can continue the work between the Food Standards Agency and Trading Standards officers and put consumers at the heart of the system as you do day to day in your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Very encouraging to hear what you have to say and the value you put on trading standards in regards to food regulation, and the fact that you recognised the issues that we are going through at the moment with resources, but looking at that as a challenge, but also as opportunities for the future. And also it was encouraging to know that TS, trading standards, environmental health, are key to future business support. And it was great to hear you talk about lots of things that TS are actually used to and have knowledge of, the system-based approach and primary authority. So thank you very much for that encouraging speech. Just to let you know, folks, we're having a little difficulty with the putting the questions in on this broadcast. However, you can ask questions of the speakers by either going to the Twitter account or by emailing us direct at tsi-events@tsi.org.uk. So that's tsi-events@tsi.org.uk. I'm sure the speakers will be wanting to answer your questions later. Okay, I'm sorry, Damien, we seem to have cut you off at during your discussions. I'd like to hand back to you now to continue your presentation, please, on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I'll try again, and I hope that maybe you're not put off. It's a very rainy day here in Northern Ireland, and all I can hear is the raindrops beating off the skylight windows. I'm sitting in my top floor makeshift office at the minute, but again, just wanted to reiterate my thanks for being able to speak here and talk about the challenges certainly that we're facing in Northern Ireland. Where I left off, I was talking about the issue of coronavirus and how none of us anticipated what the challenges would be, and certainly where we can see where regulation is badly needed. Whenever coronavirus kicked in, certainly my concerns about regulation focused mainly on our current and live investigations, how we pause them, how we were going to deal with current prosecution cases, and where we were going to go. I think pretty quickly we realised that there was an appetite and thirst and demand for consumer advice. Certainly, we had to get all our consumer line advisors working from home very quickly as the calls increased on a day-to-day basis with questions about cancellation and refunds, about things like price hikes, particularly in relation to the disruption to the travel industry. And we had to deal with over 100% increase in calls. And it's testament to the advisors and Consumer Line, and I'm sure in consumer services in Britain, to show the resilience and the dedication of the staff that we have working in the field of consumer protection, and certainly then to our enforcement staff, and taking forward those issues, trying to work with businesses and understand the particular challenges that businesses were facing. Also having to consider working from home, furloughing staff, dealing with taking bookings and providing goods and services to overnight almost changing just to processing mass refunds. The business model had to change. We had to factor that in. We also had to consider the impact that there was on consumers losing their jobs, in debts, financial difficulties, and in many cases, particularly in the travel sector and weddings, we've seen people that needed to get their money back and get it back quickly so that they could survive through the months ahead. So initially, we obviously dealt with a lot of advice issues. We had to contemplate what that would mean for us. We had to consider, was there possible breaches of consumer protection legislation under the consumer protection regulations? We had to consider unfair terms. We had to look at travel law. We also had to consider lesser known things like the common law doctrine of frustration. We had to look at variation in unfair contract terms, force majeure, and the term price gouging, which I suppose probably very few of us in the trade and standards profession were familiar with up to that point. And certainly, I suppose price gouging was where we started. We got a lot of complaints coming through about price hikes in relation to hand sanitizers, face masks, gloves, foodstuffs such as pasta, rice and flour, things that people were stockpiling and things that were in short supply. This was an area that we don't usually get too many complaints about in trade and standards. We had to consider, was this a competition law area? Was it somewhere where consumer laws could apply? Or was it just simply a question of supply and demand? And we had to consider very carefully what powers we had in this area as regulators. And it was very welcome, and many thanks to CTSI in providing guidance initially. We took the steps to write out to a number of traders that we were getting complaints about, as the CMA. There was a lot of media coverage, and certainly the threat of regulation and seeing traders shamed on social media about trying to exploit the current situation and take advantage of people having difficulties in buying hand wash and hand sanitizer. And we've seen great work from our online marketplaces in removing some of these things that were overinflated in terms of their price. But I suppose it answers to beg the question, was there the appropriate regulation in place to deal with price gouging? Did we have the right laws? Did we have to do regulation by any means in terms of actually using the media, engaging with traders, trying to shame them into doing the right thing? And certainly that got a lot of coverage, but it probably identified some deficiencies within regulation. And we've seen in other countries throughout the world, such as Italy, Croatia and South Africa, that there was price control legislation introduced. The complaints about price gouging certainly quietened down after those first initial weeks. Supply chains appeared to be good. There was moderation of sales, but there's certainly things that we need to consider if there's a second wave and a further lockdown, and the CMA have made that clear. Which again brings me on to the role of the CMA. I think that, certainly from my perspective as the Chief Inspector for Northern Ireland, those first couple of weeks were very difficult. We had challenges facing us in terms of what approach should we be taking as regulators here. It was very hard to look at traders that aren't rogue traders, who aren't involved in doing anything other than providing good services. And many consumers were being treated unfairly. The vast majority of businesses did the right thing and supplied refunds, cancelled services, and returned consumers to the position they would have been in had lockdown not happened. But we started seeing quite a lot, particularly in the likes of the travel industry, and particularly the wedding sector in Northern Ireland. And we realised that we had to focus our attention on these sectors. So the role of the CMA COVID Task Force certainly showed provide strong leadership. It provided legal cover for local authority trade and standards to carry out their regulatory activities effectively. They came out strong very early on in support of consumers. They made it quite clear that these were protections that have been hard won over the years and that consumers needed to be protected. We understood and sympathised with the position of businesses, but these were things that were in place, statute that we had to enforce. And we also had to take the right and appropriate decisions to make sure that those rights were protected and preserved. So again, a lot of the work that we did in relation to flights and package holidays, we get thousands of complaints from consumers in Northern Ireland talking about only being provided with credit notes or vouchers or rebooking options rather than refunds. And in an inordinate length of time, we're still seeing consumers reporting that flights that were cancelled back in March and April time are still awaiting refunds. But I suppose this was an area where it showed the strength of regulation, and particularly the strength of sector-specific legislation under the package travel regulations and regulation EU 261. You know, these were pieces of these were regulations that allowed us to hang our hat on, to work with the airlines, to work with the tour operators, to work with the travel agents and tell them, look, here's what the law requires of you. You must pay back refunds. And we initially got over that hurdle, but without those pieces of legislation in place, without being able to engage with the particular traders, without the CMA coming out and making it quite clear, and the Civil Aviation Authority as well, and dealing with the airlines, I'm not sure we might have got to the place that we are now, where there's definitely been a marked improvement. Consumers are still waiting for refunds, but you know, there's been undertakings and assurances that those things will be processed much quicker than they have been. We obviously took the role of writing out to a number of travel agents in Northern Ireland and publicising that through the media and engaging with traders and showing how regulation can work, understanding the concerns and the difficulties, not taking everything at face value, and certainly listening to business and telling them, hearing from them how they were able to process the refunds, how they had dealt with X number of complaints, and that usually in most cases there was only a small number of consumers affected. And that was usually to do with money coming from suppliers such as accommodation and the airline providers as well. We worked with our Consumer Council colleagues in Northern Ireland who provided and got £700,000 returned to consumers as a result of their interventions. Trading Standards also provided advice through our consumer line service. But again, we had to look and see at you know, some of those traders who aren't complying still, you know, what the next steps are going to be. And how we take that forward as regulators. That moved us on then to one of the other major sectoral problems, which is weddings and events. And we've seen in many cases refunds and deposits being refused. Wedding providers only offering rescheduling alternatives, but in many cases these weren't like for like. Things like a summer wedding being rescheduled for a winter and the same price being charged, the Saturday or Sunday wedding being moved to a Monday or a Tuesday, and no allowance made for the fact that these weren't like-for-like weddings. There's been a significant variation in terms and changes. And even in some cases, we've seen that hotels were refusing to pay deposits because they say they use that money for capital investments and improvement of the premises that the wedding's going to be hosted at. We've received 100 complaints about wedding providers. We've had to look at unfair contract terms, aggressive and misleading practices. Again, it was very welcome that the CMA provided the sectoral advice in an open letter to this particular sector. And we've had to work again with businesses, and we've received an agreement and undertakings from a number of businesses. A number of businesses have removed unfair contract terms. And we've also had thousands and thousands of pounds returned to consumers as a result of our interventions. Things that we never thought we were going to have to be dealing with at the start of the year. And I suppose like many other trading standard services, we'd certainly seen that the forward year plan we had and the priorities that were set for 2020-21 have had to be ripped up and start again as COVID has dominated everything that we've had to do. So unfortunately, we've had to open a number of cases and continue our engagement with a number of traders and hoping that we're going to get compliance with the need for enforcement. We've also had to consider issues in relation to caravan park homes. We've had queries about student accommodation. With landlords and student bodies not waiving third terms rent or allowing for the termination of contract. We've also had issues in relation to childcare and nursery fees, with full monthly fees being required while services not being provided, high retainer fees. We've had to look at things like partial payments or penalties for cancellations. We've also had to deal with things like scams. It didn't take very long for the scammers to use COVID as an opportunity again to try and part people from their money. We've quickly seen scams in relation to cures, lockdown scams where people were calling the doors offering to do work or to collect groceries for individuals, and and many other scams that we had to make sure that people were aware of and alert and try and raise awareness and education, particularly at a time during lockdown where people were more isolated, and those scam victims needed our support and help as much as ever before. We also seen doorstep crime. I think in the initial stages, obviously lockdown put paid to a number of doorstep criminals and organised crime gangs throughout Northern Ireland. But as soon as lockdown was lifted, what did we see but those doorstep criminals going out? We had complaints on a daily basis against our known doorstep criminals in Northern Ireland. We're also seeing issues with the moratoria introduced by the FCA in respect of loans and mortgages and rents, which was all very welcome. But I suppose the after of the event will be what happens now once those are lifted and people are in difficulty. Will they be subjected to aggressive debt collecting practices and all the rest that goes associated with indebtedness? Suppose we look at COVID as, did we have the tools in place? Are the existing laws sufficient to deal with such a pandemic? I've seen that consumer protection has been described by Lord Tyree as an analog system in a digital world. Again, this is probably the point that's where consumer protection might change, how businesses do their work, how we regulate might change forever. Again, the references to the new normal. I think none of us know what a new normal is going to be, and it'll probably be a new normal on a monthly and weekly and yearly basis. But it has shown the strength of regulation without those tools in place, without being able to be agile and innovative and deal quickly with businesses. I think consumers probably wouldn't have the protection that they would have received without it. We also have to consider what will the approach be in terms of our litigation and our criminal prosecutions. There has to be questions about accessibility to courts at the minute. The backlog, certainly in Northern Ireland, has pushed all our cases on the pause button. We don't know when they're going to be heard, if we're likely to take cases, and what time, which year will they be heard. And we're also not sure about the decisions of the courts. As welcome as the CMA advice and guidance is, businesses will certainly push back against that advice, and we're not quite sure how judges, particularly will consider some of the contractual issues in respect of variation. This might be the way of the world for the next couple of years, and we're certainly not sure how things are all going to pan out. But one of the things that we certainly did see was regulators working together, the partnership working, certainly through the Consumer Protection Partnership, through organisations and enforcement bodies working together, particularly with the CMA and the Civil Aviation Authority, has really stood the test of time. And certainly I know in Britain, OPSS working with local trading standards on business closures and product safety matters, which we didn't have to deal with in Northern Ireland. That certainly has something that's worked well and showed the strength of community within the consumer protection field. And not to be outdone, coronavirus has dominated everything, but certainly in this part of the world, Brexit has never been far from our minds. I certainly look at my role, and I'm as Chief Inspector for the Northern Ireland Trade and Standard Service. Has been a bit of a baptism of fire. We had to work with cuts that happened just shortly before I took over. We then had to quickly deal with Brexit and what that meant for Northern Ireland, and we've had to deal with coronavirus. So it's been a bit of a poison chalice, but something that, like we always do, we show the resilience and integrity, and we try and get through these things. So certainly for us, looking at Brexit, we have to see, well, what's regulation going to look like once we leave? Well, we've left, but what's it going to look like come 1st of January? Are we going to diverge? Are we going to align with the European Union? We have to consider aspects of trade deals. We have to look at the UK Internal Markets Bill. We look at the threats and the risks and the opportunity, and we're certainly going to have to ask questions about what will happen to our standards. Certainly it's a crumb of comfort that the government still is adamant that there will be no less protections, that they will use a common rule book, and they'll look at the key regulations and networks that can't be unilaterally created by the UK, and certainly need reciprocity from the EU 27. As we age ever closer to the 1st of January, we have to consider what a no deal certainly will mean for people in these parts of these islands. Certainly for us in Northern Ireland, we know what it means. The Northern Ireland Protocol will come into play on the 1st of January, but it brings with it a lot of key considerations and questions that will remain unanswered, and remain unanswered only 3 months before that date is due to kick in. We have to look at what the impacts of future divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain will mean. Northern Ireland has consumer protection as the devolved competency, and we're already seeing tensions between products being allowed in the GB market and not being allowed in the Northern Ireland market through the result of the fair trade agreement with Japan. Wine that can't be sold by particular units of measurement, because in Northern Ireland we're going to remain aligned to the EU statute books on particular goods. We also have big questions about market surveillance. Market surveillance can only be done if it has the resources to ensure that it's robust and efficient. And without the resources, the advice, application and enforcement that we will have to carry out will probably be rendered ineffective. We're still waiting very much at this moment of time to find out what's going to happen, what resources we're going to need to carry out market surveillance in Northern Ireland, and we'll certainly have to work with our colleagues at OTSS and certainly with lead officers, particularly in the area of legal metrology. Again, for us in Northern Ireland, we're going to be the entry point to both the UK and the EU single markets. We're the only part of these islands that share a land border with another EU member state. And if you're looking to get fake and unsafe goods into either or either market, then I suspect Northern Ireland is the place that's going to take place. We probably anticipate an increase in rogue trading and doorstep crime, car crime, IP crime, and scams, and all those things that we have to look at a time when we've had our resources crushed, we've lost skills, we've lost competencies. And then we also have to consider what's going to happen, post-COVID. Will there be austerity Mark II? Will trading standards be hit once again? So again, moving on from that, we have to look and consider the economic recovery and our role again as regulators. We're going to have to shield the most vulnerable consumers from the worst impacts of the recession. We have to look at dangerous and harmful products entering into the markets as a result of COVID and Brexit. We're also going to have to turn our attention to try and support businesses, which we do very well at the minute, but businesses are going to need our support, and they're going to demand advice and guidance as they diversify and try and meet the challenges of surviving post-Brexit. Businesses will innovate. We're going to see markets that probably don't exist at the minute, and we're certainly going to have to be adaptable and resilient and be there to provide that advice and guidance. We're also going to have to help them with new legislation and requirements that are brought about because of Brexit. But we're also going to have to look at.
Sorry, we're going to have to move on, David, because we have Damon, because we have a little bit of limited time. Sorry so much to interrupt you, but we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much for bringing to the attention of all the down to the ground issues that many of us have actually dealt with. Can I please now turn our attention to Mick King, Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. I'm going to hand over to you straight away, Mick, if that's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Phil. It's an honour to be back at the Symposium and speaking in such illustrious company. However, I am conscious that I'm the fifth of 5 speakers. Much of what I might have said about the theory of regulation has been said more eloquently by others who are still active in the profession. I'm also conscious we're squeezed on time, so I'll try and keep this short. And what I thought I'd do to address the question in the title of the session, which is why does regulation matter? I thought I would just tell 2 short stories, really, drawn from my time in the trade and standards profession, that illustrate why, as somebody who now sits on the outside of the system, why I still think regulation is so important, but also some of the difficulties in making that case in the external world. In a nutshell, the point I'm going to be making is that I think there are 2 overarching arguments that can be made in favour of effective regulation in the current context. The first is a moral and ethical one. The second is an economic one. And both of those are important if we're going to win those arguments. I'll say a little bit about each of those things. Firstly, the moral and ethical case for regulation. When I worked in trade and standards, my specialism was in consumer safety, particularly toy safety. And in that capacity, I remember being contacted one time by a coroner's office who asked me to do an investigation into the death of a toddler who had been killed by a toy while playing in her bedroom. I'll spare you the details of the case, which were heartbreaking. But when we investigated the death of that child, what we found was that her death was completely avoidable. It was caused by a foreseeable and widely recognised design issue. And the manufacturer of the toy had simply failed to comply with established standards. Now, for me, sitting in that child's house and explaining that reality to her bereaved parents, I think was one of the starkest moments of connection for me between what can sometimes seem like a dry theoretical debate about regulation and actually the real devastating human impacts of the failure to meet regulatory standards can have. And whilst not all regulatory activity has such severe life and death consequences, I think it's, incumbent on us in all our deliberations that we should never lose sight of that human dimension, and the social and ethical consequences of regulation. However, that case also highlights some of the difficulties in making that moral case for regulation, because it was unusual in many respects, and in many ways it was an exception that proves the rule. In that case, the direct link between the regulatory regime and its purpose was glaringly obvious, but in my experience, that's seldom the case. It was unusual, for example, in that case, that a third party, such as the coroner, should draw a clear line of sight between cause and effect. More usually, I think the complexity of the systems in which regulation operates make it extremely difficult to draw simple causative connections between negative societal outcomes and weaknesses or failures in the regulatory framework. And ironically, I think that drawing those linkages is actually harder where regulation is successful. The case I've just talked about was memorable in part because it was an example of the system failing. I think it's much harder to tell the same story where we've been successful in protecting people. My point is that good regulation stops bad things happening. So by definition, the evidence to prove its success is always going to be elusive. So whilst I think we should never stop talking about the ethics and the morals of regulation, I think that on its own is insufficient. Which brings me to the second story, which is about the economic case. 20 years ago, I found myself working at the heart of a different national crisis, just as many, as we've heard today, in the profession are doing with coronavirus today. 20 years ago, it was a very different epidemic, foot and mouth disease, which fortunately affected just animals, not people. One of the tasks that my department had during that outbreak was to investigate the possible causes of the disease outbreak and to investigate the farm from which the disease was thought to have spread. Now, that farm was a small unit for swill feeding pigs, a business which was always on the margins of economic viability, operating under a license from the Ministry of Agriculture. Now, the law at that time allowed pigs to be fed on human food waste on the proviso that the food had been heat treated to remove all potential virus transmission into the animal food chain. However, the law at the time didn't require the kind of separation that might have been desirable between the different stages of the process to deal with the risks involved. It's therefore no surprise that when our investigators went onto that farm, we found that the swill hadn't been properly processed, and that instead it had been fed straight to the animals. Now, on one level, that was a mundane and wholly predictable non-compliance. Yet it was one that absolutely devastated the UK food and farming industries at the time. The interesting economic dimension to that is that in preparing a prosecution case for court, we calculated how much the farmer had saved by not complying with the regulations. And we estimated he'd saved in total about £150. Now compare that £150 that motive to break the rules with the cost to the country. The foot and mouth outbreak was calculated to cost UK PLC somewhere in the region of £9 billion for a £150 breach of the rules. And it wasn't just the effects on the UK economy as a whole that were significant. There were structural changes to the food and farming economy as a direct consequence of that breach. Swill feeding had always been known to be high risk, yet at the time it was subject to controls that were in retrospect weak and ineffective, and they weren't commensurate to the risks that that type of business posed to the wider sector. As a result, the livelihood, reputation and viability of huge numbers of reputable livestock farmers were impacted. The wider rural economy for food, hospitality and tourism was devastated over a prolonged period. Many businesses never recovered. And ironically, the swill industry itself, which under better regulation might have had a viable place in the economy, was wiped out in its entirety overnight and made unlawful. So I think that the value for money business case for better regulation of that scenario was made out in the harshest possible manner. And that experience for me highlighted better than anything the overwhelming economic case to be made in the interest of business itself for having proportionately robust regulatory regimes in place to control foreseeable risks in the market and have that backed up by effective day-to-day oversight of compliance. And the conclusion I've come to, as somebody who now stands outside the system, is that whilst it was the human and ethical factors that motivated me as a professional, the more pressing argument, particularly in the current context, the post-Brexit post-COVID landscape is that high quality regulation is a vital ingredient in the future success of a high standards, high performing, high value economy. Thanks very much, Phil. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mick, for your presentation and for keeping us right on time. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Okay, we're running quite short of time. We have quite a few questions that have been asked. I'm going to suggest that those questions are looked at during the week, and we look at providing written answers to, I think, a lot of them because of the timescales we have now, and I know that other sessions are very quickly coming upon us. We just have time for just one question, I think, that sums up a lot of the questions that are being asked. It is to do with the elephant in the room, resources. And in particularly, Graham and Emily, I'd like you just to have your thoughts just find on how are you going to ensure the ambitious plans you have both set out will be able to be delivered locally, please. So in turn, both Graham and Emily, if you could answer that, please. Who would like to go first?
Shall I go first?
Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really important question. So one of the issues about the Food Standards Agency is that we don't have resources that we can distribute directly to local authorities, other than on some small programmes like sampling, because the grant that goes to pay for your work comes through the general grant that goes through the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So the thing that we can do is use our voice. We can use the evidence that we collect through our local authority enforcement monitoring system, through surveys, and through what we can see on the ground about the resource that is or isn't being used locally, the effect of that in terms of interventions with food businesses, and the consequent risk. So we are making our voice loud and clear on that to the Treasury at the moment. We've done a submission. Our board says it in public. And the point that I keep trying to come back to is not just the inputs, but the outcomes. As I said at the start of my speech, this is about the food industry and the economic well-being of the country, not just the health of the country. The health of the country is really important too from a food point of view, but in order that consumers trust food businesses and that people who want to import British food trust it, we have to have a regulatory system that protects it. And my argument is it's actually quite cheap at the price. So the consumers spend something like £270 billion on food every year. There are 500,000 businesses. There are 400 local authorities, and there's one Food Standards Agency in Food Standards Scotland. And between us, we probably cost about £240 million compared to that billions and billions that's spent. So it's that voice that's important. Second thing on resources, though, is that we also need to make your job easier. So it's important that we have tools for you that mean you don't have to do things twice, that you're really resourcing to risk. So the registering a food business service that I described earlier is one of those tools, but we need to, as the central competent authority, keep thinking about how we can package up information and intelligence to you so that you can do your job more effectively. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Phil. If I come in next perhaps on that, and I'm not going to repeat what Emily said, but I agree with those 2 points. I think they're fundamental. Colleagues will be aware that the government is engaged in this spending review at the moment, which is looking at the future of resourcing of everything that government does, including regulation, both local and national. And Emily's described what the Food Standards Agency have put into the public domain on that space. I'm a little bit less free than she is to talk about what we're doing in that space because I'm part of the government department, but I can confidently say that the issues that she's reported around food are also recognised around other areas of trade and standards activity. But equally, there won't be a lot of money around for the future, and it would be a mistake to think that we're going to see enormous resources centrally. I think there will be recognition of the value and the work that trade and standards do as part of the work that local authorities do, but I don't think we're going to see a magic bullet. I also don't think there is such a thing as a magic bullet if you double the amount of money, would that be enough? Do you need to put a note on it? What is the right amount that would enable everything to be wonderful? And people say, oh well, back in such a day it was this much money, but I'm old enough to remember some of those such a days, and I know in those days people look back to a previous such a day when there was more money and less work to do. So I think it's as much about how we use what we have, and I think some of the things that everyone who's spoken in the session have talked about: risk, intelligence, foresight, central local partnerships, working with business to extract the best from what they do rather than assuming that we can do everything ourselves, consumer empowerment, consumer education. I think these are going to be the key to the future. And I think what you get from UPSS is a commitment that we will continue the work we've done in the past 2.5 years, working with frontline officers, working through CTSI, building capacity, building training. But the work that you do at the front line is the work that can only be done at the front line. I think as long as we can recognise that together, then we can make the best of what we have. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much, Emily and Graham, for answering that question. We do thankfully have a lot of questions. We really don't have time for them at the moment. I'm sure we can get answers to those questions as we go through on the week, but if not, we can respond by making sure we've got those answers on our website on the hub going forward. Okay, so a big thank you to our speakers this morning. Of course, the Minister for starting us off this morning, for Graham, Damien, Emily and Mick. Thank you very much for your welcome presentations. Really shows that you are valuing what trading standards are delivering, have delivered and are doing, and also you're there to support us going forward in the challenges that certainly lie ahead. And I think everybody who has listened want to thank you very much for being part of this presentation today. And I think we've all come to understand the value of trading standards in the landscape we have, and you know, what's been delivered recently, how we've stepped up and made our mark, but also we're going to be looking at being prepared for future events. Thank you very much. I appreciate that there's lots of other events going on the rest of the day, and I'd like to end this this session now so those can take place. Thank you very much, everyone, and speak to you soon. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone.